The Kremlin says Russian President Vladimir Putin has visited a military command center in Russia's Kursk region.
На территории Курской области.
And yeah, I'd love to meet with him or talk to him, but we have to get it over with fast.
Vladimir Putin says he supports the US-led ceasefire deal for Ukraine.
What's the plan if Putin doesn't agree to a ceasefire?
Bad news for this world.
Will the war between Ukraine and Russia end? This question has recently become the main focus for all sides. The United States is making a sustained effort to ensure that peace is restored in Eastern Europe.
I'm looking for peace. We're not looking to go into a 10-year war and play games. We want peace.
The Ukrainian side is trying to adapt to these efforts.
І щоб за час тиші підготувати відповіді на всі питання про довгострокову безпеку та реальний, надійний.
Russia is watching the peace process from afar. The Moscow regime probably thinks that it has the upper hand. Last time, there was a very important summit in Saudi Arabia to bring the war between Ukraine and Russia to a peaceful footing. Following this summit, Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky accepted the 30-day temporary peace offered by the United States.
І на 30 днів спробувати встановити повне припинення вогню.
After negotiations in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, Ukraine confirmed the one-month ceasefire proposed by the United States on condition that Russia complies. The Kremlin was also expected to ratify this agreement. U.S. President Donald Trump claimed that a group of officials were on their way to Russia as Moscow was considering the ceasefire in Ukraine proposed by the United States. President Donald Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, is expected to visit the Kremlin this week to present a ceasefire proposal and discuss the terms of a peace deal. It is thought that this visit is intended to persuade Russian President Vladimir Putin. It was suggested that Donald Trump sent a delegation to Moscow for this reason. In fact, a senior official from the Trump regime said in a private statement that he was confident that Russia would accept a peace agreement. U.S. Vice President Sebastian Gorka told Andrew Marr that Russia's losses during its 3-year occupation of Ukraine had made it difficult to continue the war politically.
Meat grinder for the last 3+ years, and he wants one thing to happen now, and that's for the bloodshed.
So far, the Kremlin has said it wants to talk directly with the United States before deciding on a ceasefire proposal. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Moscow was waiting for detailed information on the proposal. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said she did not rule out contacts with U.S. representatives in the coming days, but emphasized that the positions of the Russian Federation do not depend on agreements made abroad. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin has made such a move during Donald Trump's peace efforts that the situation is expected to escalate. Vladimir Putin wore a full military uniform for the first time since launching his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, at a time when possible peace talks are approaching. Putin's decision to wear a military uniform appeared to be aimed at bolstering his image as a wartime leader and boosting domestic morale ahead of possible peace talks to end the conflict, now in its 4th year. U.S. President Donald Trump, on the other hand, took an unexpected approach to Putin wearing Russian military uniforms, signaling that the Kremlin had no choice but to accept peace. We will now take a closer look at how Mr. Trump has threatened Mr. Putin with this latest stance and where the war is heading in the wake of this threat. We will look at what Mr. Trump's leverage against Putin is. We will also examine whether Mr. Trump will be able to convince Let's get started. Vladimir Putin's messages in his military uniform, which threatened and seriously angered U.S. President Donald Trump. Appearing in his military uniform, Putin made important assessments while visiting a command center in the western Kursk region of Russia on the border with Ukraine. The Russian leader suggested the creation of a buffer zone along the border. Russian state media reported that Putin visited the region for the first time since the cross-border operation and instructed his military to push Ukrainian forces back from the region as soon as possible. Russian and North Korean troops deployed to fight alongside Putin's forces have reportedly recently regained control of some villages in the Kursk region. In this regard, the Russian leader shares predictions about what will happen in Kursk. Putin stated that Ukrainian soldiers will be treated as traitors according to the laws of the Russian Federation.
На территории Курской области правоохранительным органам и специальным службам в соответствии с законами Российской Федерации являются террористами.
This statement was quite harsh and gave important clues about the Russian leader's future approach to both the war in general and what will happen in the Kursk Oblast. Putin's wearing of a military uniform, his statements about Kursk and the conditions he laid down were almost like a message of intimidation to Trump. In fact, the Russian leader said in a statement that he was in favor of a 30-day ceasefire, but emphasized that there were nuances in what he would accept. At a press conference in Moscow, the Russian capital, Mr. Putin said the proposal must lead to a lasting peace in his eyes and address what the Kremlin calls root causes. These were Putin's words ahead of his full-scale invasion of Ukraine in early 2022. These included the disarmament of Ukraine and adherence to neutrality status. The Russian leader also said that an acceptable agreement would require Ukraine to stop further troop deployment and training. In addition, Putin also mentioned the absence of military support for Kiev during the ceasefire as one of the conditions sought by Putin. The Russian leader laid out his conditions and gave the US its turn to act again. But Vladimir Putin received an unexpected response from Donald Trump. Saying that it takes two to tango, Trump implied that the decision was now up to Russia. Mr. Trump then warned of devastating consequences if Russia did not accept the peace agreement. This critical statement was a much harsher move than Mr. Putin's remarks about Kursk while wearing a military uniform. The American president said that it was now in Russia's hands to begin the possibility of peace, implying that he could impose further sanctions on Russia if Putin rejects the proposed 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine. Speaking to reporters in the Oval Office, Donald Trump suggested that he could do financial things that would be very bad for Russia, that would be devastating for Russia. However, Mr. Trump stressed that he did not want to do these things because he just wanted to see peace. Mr. Trump then reflected on the results of the disastrous Oval Office meeting between himself and Zelensky and tried to signal that peace was getting closer. As we can infer from the U.S. leader's behavior, it seems unlikely that the Russian president will not accept the peace proposal after all. But one must also take into account Mr. Putin's peculiarities, his unique strategies. Mr. Putin may be willing to take all the risks and put Russia in the fire. In other words, Putin may ignore Trump's peace overtures and continue his occupation of Ukraine. In such a case, what kind of a reaction would Russia face from the United States? The first alternative is for the U.S. to send the most powerful game-changing weapons to Ukraine. Donald Trump has already ordered the immediate start of military assistance. Mr. Trump announced his decision to resume security and intelligence assistance to Ukraine after talks between the two countries in Saudi Arabia. By making such a decision, the U.S. leader may have calculated that Russia would back down on peace. Trump may have taken this decision early in his efforts to persuade Putin. Last week, the United States suspended hundreds of millions of dollars of American security assistance to Ukraine and halted intelligence sharing. President Donald Trump had claimed that Kiev was not ready for peace. This drastic step followed a disastrous meeting between Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office that ended in a shouting match. Had the aid suspension been indefinitely extended, it could have depleted Ukraine's ammunition stocks and also hampered its ability to target Russian positions. European officials across the continent reacted with concern to this decision and initiated several rounds of meetings on how Ukraine could continue to defend itself without U.S. assistance. But now, with the U.S. decision, aid has resumed through Poland. By sending Patriots, HIMARS, Abrams tanks, and many other military vehicles and equipment to Ukraine, the Trump regime can convince Russia to make peace. In addition to the ceasefire offer, U.S. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz said that the U.S. and Ukraine have discussed humanitarian concerns and the security guarantees Ukraine is seeking. At this point, Kiev has asked for American military commitment to enforce any peace agreement signed with Russia, which broke ceasefires 3 years ago and launched a full-scale invasion. The debate is on how Russia will respond to all this and what the U.S. will do next to try to convince Putin to make peace. So what is the next step? In addition to resuming military aid to Ukraine, the next U.S. decision is likely to be to revive sanctions against Russia. Donald Trump has already threatened Vladimir Putin with economic weapons. As for sanctions, the U.S. has already taken action. The Trump administration is imposing further restrictions on Russia's oil, gas, and banking sectors, further limiting Russia's access to U.S. payment systems. These restrictions are being implemented, according to 4 people close to the plans. The Treasury Department ended a 60-day exemption put in place by the Biden administration in January that allowed certain energy transactions involving sanctioned Russian banks to continue. By allowing the exemption to expire, the banks may no longer be able to access U.S. payment systems to conduct large energy transactions. Russian financial institutions exempted from sanctions included Vneshekonombank, Bank Financial Corporation, Otkritai, Sovcombank, Sberbank, VTB Bank, Alfa Bank, Rosbank, Bank Zenit, Bank St. Petersburg, and the Central Bank of Russia. The decision to further restrict access to American banking systems makes it harder for other countries to buy Russian oil, thus limiting its global supply. It could lead to a further price increase of up to $5 per barrel, a significant jump after the low prices of recent weeks. In total, 7,500 of the approximately 25,000 sanctions were imposed by the United States. In mid-January 2025, the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control and the U.S. State Department sanctioned about 250 organizations and individuals who evaded U.S.-imposed sanctions targeting Russia. The U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control subsequently added another 100 Russian entities to the sanctions list. The state designated more than 150 individuals and entities pursuant to the executive order. These designations targeted parties identified as producers, exporters, and importers of products critical to Russia's military-industrial base. The impact of the U.S. sanctions on the Russian economy has been severe. These sanctions were also supported by the EU. The sanctions imposed by the EU and its partners on Russia's financial system have reduced Russia's ability to finance the war. The Russian central bank's reserves of $300 billion have been blocked in the EU, other G7 countries, and Australia. 70% of the Russian banking system's assets are under sanctions. More than 1,500 sanctioned individuals and organizations have had their assets frozen to the tune of about $20 billion. In total, Russia is estimated to have suffered more than $350 billion in losses following the U.S. sanctions moves. In other words, the recent U.S. sanctions alone have cost Russia more than $50 billion. This is a truly incredible number. This is the economic aspect of Donald Trump's veiled threats to Vladimir Putin. Mr. Trump may play the economic sanctions trump card more intensely in order to push Putin further into a corner. Russia's economy is currently too fragile to withstand prolonged U.S. sanctions. Russia's military might is also not sufficient to counter the U.S., and it seems to have no choice. We are hearing incredible data from analysts and war experts that Russia's military losses exceed 700,000, tank losses 3,000, artillery losses 20,000. It is unlikely that an army that has to face such critical losses will be able to sustain this war for a long time. Moreover, the fact that the Russian army has been falling behind the U.S., Kiev's most important ally, in terms of military power since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, shows that Putin is in an unsustainable situation. According to recent reports by the Ukrainian Intelligence Directorate, the war between Russia and Ukraine could end in late 2025 or early 2026. If U.S. President Donald Trump can convince Russian President Vladimir Putin to make peace sooner by demonstrating his country's military might, the war could end sooner. In fact, one of the details that Putin fears the most is that the United States is increasing its military spending at an incredible rate every year. In 2024, the U.S. remains at the top of the list of countries with the highest military spending. The U.S. defense budget for the fiscal year 2024 is $883.7 billion. In 2025, this budget is expected to exceed $1 trillion. Russia's military expenditure in the fiscal year 2024 is $140 billion. Russia's military spending has also increased to 7.1% of its gross domestic product. So there is a huge difference between the U.S. and Russia's military budgets. In terms of manpower, the United States is the third most populous military in the world, with about 1.4 million active military personnel and about 818,000 reservists. Russia, on the other hand, is the fifth largest military manpower force, with about 1.15 million active duty personnel and 2 million reservists. The United States is ahead of Russia in terms of active personnel. In terms of air power, Russia has 1,153 combat-capable aircraft and 76 bombers. The United States has 1,574 combat-capable aircraft and a fleet of 157 bombers, including 76 B-52s, 45 B-1Bs, and 19 B-2s. Russia also lags far behind the United States in terms of air power. In the Navy, the United States has a firm advantage over Russian naval power. The U.S. has 14 ballistic missile nuclear-powered submarines, 53 guided missile submarines, 11 aircraft carriers, 111 cruisers, destroyers and frigates, and 31 amphibious ships. Russia has 11 ballistic missile nuclear-powered submarines, 40 guided missile submarines, 1 aircraft carrier, 30 cruisers, destroyers, and frigates, and 46 amphibious ships. The two countries are in deep rivalry over nuclear weapons and power. The U.S. and Russia have attracted the world's attention as the leading nuclear powers. The U.S. conducted its nuclear test in 1945 and became a nuclear superpower. 4 years later, the Soviet Union joined the trend with its first nuclear explosion in 1949. In total, both states possess 89% of the world's total inventory of nuclear weapons and 86% of the world's stockpiled warheads. The United States has 50-44 nuclear weapons and Russia 55-80. Russia currently has one of the largest nuclear armies with a variety of nuclear weapons, equipped with strategic bombers, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and intercontinental ballistic missiles. Moreover, Russia implies in its nuclear doctrine the idea of escalate to de-escalate, where it retains the right to use or deploy nuclear weapons in retaliation to a conventional attack that threatens national integrity and security. When we look at all these values, we can see how Russia, which continues to wait for the U.S. leadership in the field of non-nuclear military power, is experiencing a setback. The U.S. military is better in every respect. It has very few weaknesses. From naval warfare to air power, precision strike capability, reconnaissance and intelligence, and special operations. In comparison, the U.S. has more fighter jets, military bases, and bombers, while Russia is stronger in ground forces, artillery, tanks, and ground vehicles. The most powerful bomb in the U.S. nuclear arsenal is the B-83, with an explosive power of 1.2 megatons. Russia's nuclear arsenal, by contrast, has consistently remained a threat. If U.S. President Donald Trump puts more pressure on Russian President Vladimir Putin, reintroduces economic sanctions, and makes many other decisions, experts are concerned that the Kremlin regime may put the option of using nuclear weapons on the table more aggressively. But the prospect of Vladimir Putin considering such an option in the wake of Donald Trump's pressure on the peace process would indeed not be good for Russia. After all, the U.S. side has nuclear weapons close to what Russia has. The EU members also have nuclear weapons. If Putin clashes with Trump on this issue, the EU wing could directly support Trump and make things much better with the U.S. This time, Vladimir Putin could face not only Trump, but also European leaders. At the moment, just like Donald Trump, the EU is trying to convince Russia to make peace. In short, considering all these details, Putin's only chance seems to be to accept the peace proposal. Continuing the war under these circumstances will probably only harm Russia. Thank you for watching.